Okay, so I'm going to start out by reading you a little section of a book, a story. So this is from a book called The Surrender Experiment by Michael Singer. He's not a Buddhist. He is a spiritual teacher down in Florida in Swami Yogananda's tradition. So the way he tells it, in 1970, when he was around 20 years old, he was hanging out with his best friend Ronnie. It says, Ronnie was sitting on that couch with me on that fateful day in 1970. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, but there had been a lull in our leisurely conversation. I noticed I was uncomfortable with the silence, and I found myself thinking of what to say next. I had been in similar situations many times before, but something was quite different about this experience. Instead of simply being uncomfortable and trying to find something to say, I noticed that I was uncomfortable and trying to find something to say. For the first time in my life, my mind and emotions were something I was watching instead of being. I know that it is difficult to put into words, but there was a complete sense of separation between my anxious mind, which was spewing out possible topics to talk about, and me, the one who was simply aware that my mind was doing this. It was like I was suddenly able to remain above my mind and quietly watch the thoughts being created. Believe it or not, that subtle shift in my seat of awareness became a tornado that rearranged my entire life. For a few moments, I just sat there inwardly watching myself try to fix the awkward silence. But I was not the one trying to fix it. I was the one quietly watching the activity of my mind trying to fix it. At first, there were only a few degrees of separation between me and what I was watching, but every second the separation seemed to become greater and greater. I was not doing anything to cause this shift. I was just there noticing that my sense of me no longer included the neurotic thought patterns that were passing in front of me. The entire process of becoming aware was practically instantaneous. It was like when you stare at one of those posters that has a hidden picture inside. At first it appears to be just a circle with line patterns. Then suddenly you see an entire 3D image emerge from what originally looked like chaos. Once you see it, you can't imagine how you hadn't seen it before. It was right there. Such was the shift that happened inside of me. It was so obvious. I was in there watching my thoughts and emotions. I had always been in there watching, but I had been too unaware to notice. It was as though I had been so involved in their details that I never saw them as just thoughts and emotions. Within seconds, what previously seemed like important solutions for how to break the uncomfortable silence was now sounding like a neurotic voice talking inside my head. I watched as that voice tried out things to say. The weather's been awesome, hasn't it? Did you hear what Nixon did the other day? It's 1970. You want to get something to eat? When I finally did open my mouth to say something, what I said was, have you ever noticed that there's this voice talking inside your head? Ronnie looked at me like I was a little weird, and then a spark lit in his eyes. He said, yeah, I see what you're talking about, and mine never shuts up. I distinctly remember making a joke out of it by asking him what it would be like if he heard someone else's voice talking in there. We laughed, and life went on. But not my life. My life didn't just go on. In my life, nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't have to try to maintain this awareness. It was who I was now. I was the being who was watching the incessant flow of thoughts pass through the mind. So I thought that was a really interesting, I really liked that story when I first read it. Because it was this spontaneous experience. He wasn't trying to meditate, right? He wasn't trying to do anything. He just spontaneously had this experience where he suddenly started to notice that these thoughts that are passing through his mind were just thoughts passing through his mind, and that he could be aware of them. as something that he wasn't so identified with. I think I've actually given a talk one time in the past, probably 3 or 4 years ago, about meditation on thoughts, because at the time I had just done a retreat with some insight meditation teachers in Minnesota who used that as the main topic of their practice. In Thai's tradition, we typically do meditation by using the breath as an object to allow us to calm ourselves down. And that's an example of what is in the Buddhist tradition is called shamatha practice. Shamatha is a Sanskrit word. And in Sanskrit, it means stopping. Actually, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this quite a bit. And there's really 2 primary groups of meditation practices in Buddhism. So shamatha practices are one group, and they have to do with stopping and just being. Or another way, the Tibetan word jine means calm abiding. So just resting in a calm way. And the second set of practices are called vipassana in Sanskrit, and Thai translates that as looking deeply, but most other teachers translate it as insight meditation. And for most Buddhist teachers, this means insight into the true nature of reality, an insight that brings liberation from the ups and downs, the suffering of our usual existence. So most of us started our mindfulness practice by things like this breath practice. And such practices nourish stability of mind, calm, and an increased ability to be able to direct our mind where we want it to go instead of where our thoughts running around just decide they want to take us. As my Tibetan teacher, Mingyu Rinpoche, says, these practices make our minds pliable and workable. One problem that arises for all of us when we first do practices like mindfulness of the breath is that we find ourselves constantly distracted and lost in thought. So we sit there and we say, okay, I'm going to pay attention to my breath right now. And when I first learned, I learned counting the breaths, and that's really embarrassing, counting your breaths, because you get to 2 and then you not only get lost in thought, you can't even remember what number you were on. So thoughts are a challenge in this kind of meditation. And so most of us, I think, when we encounter this, we begin to be a little irritated by these thoughts that are continually sweeping us away from this little nascent experience that we're having of calm and peace. In the Turgar tradition, which I've been practicing in mostly the last couple of years, it's interesting because they teach these shamatha practices in a little bit different way. Instead of emphasizing maintaining concentration on the object, which causes, this is why we experience frustration with the constant intrusion of thoughts, or even sound. One time I was sitting here and they used to do the drum and bugle corps, the International Drum and Bugle Corps competition was up at Camp Randall, and they were practicing back there on the bike path. And I think there were still railroad tracks then. It was a long time ago. And so we were in here trying to meditate while they were drumming. I mean, it was incredibly loud. You couldn't believe it. And I was trying to concentrate on the breath, and it was nearly impossible. But in the Turgar tradition, instead of trying to concentrate, stay on an object, they instead emphasize developing the ability to take every experience and use it to support our meditation, even the drums, even our thoughts. Practicing resting our awareness on the thoughts is something that's found in all the Buddhist traditions. As I said, I first encountered it in the American Insight meditation tradition Ty also mentions in his books, and I have a one paragraph. It's in his favorite sutra. There it is. Which is the Sutra on the Full Awareness of Breathing. One of the practices is specifically to meditate by, he translates it as experiencing mind, I breathe in, experiencing mind, I breathe out. And he says, if mental formations manifest during meditation and prevent you from meditating, you may have to practice recognizing them one by one. This is also meditation. When a thought, feeling, perception, pain, or sorrow manifests itself, simply practice breathing in and out and recognize it for what it is. Say, I know you are there, I am here for you, and embrace it. So that's an example of this mindfulness of thoughts in Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition. As that first passage I read suggests, when we can begin to be aware of our thoughts, instead of being dragged around by them or trying to fight them off, which are usually the way we respond to thoughts. Mingyu Rinpoche has this wonderful, cute way of expressing it. So he says, blobbity, 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 blobbity. That's our thoughts, right? For all of us, it's always going, blobbity, 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 blobbity. And usually, we're so identified with those thoughts that wherever they go, we go. So I'm thirsty, I want Stephen's water. Okay, let's see, oh yeah, I got to remember to open that curtains back up when I'm done. Oh yeah, let's see, and the lights. You know, it's like your thoughts going back round and round. You're just kind of following wherever they want to go, you just go. When we're meditating and we want to fight with it, when we don't want to be thinking, and they're annoying us, instead the blobbity, blobbity, blobbity starts up, and we go away! No. Go away! I said go away! No, I want some calm. No. Blobbity, 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 I'm thirsty. Blah, 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 I'm hungry. Whatever it is. So when you're mindful thoughts, your relationship to, they're still going blobbity, 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 blobbity. But as Ty says, you just turn towards them and you say, oh, hello, there you are. And they go over here, oh, you're thinking about that, oh. And so you just watch them. And so let's take a few moments to experiment with some different meditations, practices that people do to pay attention to thoughts. So find a comfortable sitting position, what Thich Nhat Hanh calls chrysanthemum position, whatever is comfortable. It's not lotus, it's just chrysanthemum. It's like the flowers go every which way, so whatever is comfortable. So find your bodies. Feel yourself sitting on the chair, on the floor. Notice the sensations of in your body, in your feet, in your bottom, in your back. And as always, we find our breath as a beginning place. So now I invite you, when thoughts arise, just turn towards them and say, thoughts. And as long as they're there, just every so often, you just note that you're thinking. And if there's no thoughts, you just come back to the breath. So now I invite you to try something a little different. Just letting go of the breath and letting go of the noting practice. And just turn towards your thoughts and just notice what you're thinking. Allowing thinking to happen whenever it chooses. And if there are spaces in between the thoughts, just rest quietly until the next thought arises. Just being curious, what are these thoughts? What am I thinking? What is it like to be thinking? There's no right thing to happen. For some of us, when we look at thoughts, they disappear. For some of us, it's just an ongoing chattering that we can pay attention to. But whatever your experience is, that's your experience. And just be present to that experience, the thoughts and the experience of them. So I'm curious what people experience with that. Would a few people be willing to share with us what happened when you tried watching your thoughts?
I have a question or a comment, kind of. When I read about what you were talking about, thinking and whatnot, my first question to myself was, what are good thoughts or acceptable thoughts, and which are not, like anger and hate and fear and frustration and all those things. Are those something that I need to embrace as well as other thoughts?
So why don't we hold that question, and I'll come back to it in a minute.
Okay.
And anybody want to comment about their experience with the meditation with thoughts?
I was a little surprised to find that what arose in me was almost more images than thoughts.
Yeah.
And when I think about how I think and process stuff when I think, it makes sense because I do things very visually. And I noticed that some of was so aware that I wanted to watch my thoughts, not so many thoughts actually arose. And instead, I was able to see kind of all these images that shoot out probably much more frequently than my actual thoughts do. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it funny that when we're meditating on the breath and we're wanting to be on the breath and not thinking, then we have lots of thoughts, and then we pay attention to the thoughts, and then they're a little bit shyer. And I didn't say, but Mingyur Rinpoche teaches that what he calls thoughts have three parts. So one is the verbal, blobbity, 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 but another part is the visual. He says it's, what does he say, audio, visual, and the other part is feelings. It's kind of like, so there's like a gradient between thoughts and emotions. So thoughts are mostly audio and visual, and emotions have more of the feeling, the body feeling sense. Others? Yeah.
I had almost the opposite experience. But also I kind of that I've hardly read about when a guy starts noticing he's separate. I had a partial experience like that starting last fall, and I think it's when I was starting to attend more often Sanghas, and of just, not for everything that, but for an important relationship that was developing, feeling completely separate, like, oh, I'm thinking that this scary thing could happen. Wow, I'm really thinking that. And just sort of not actually being pulled into the craziness of the neurotic fear, but watching it.
Yeah.
And I think I had it all known. And then just now, I started with an image, and thank you for pointing it was an image of boiling garlic and a recipe. And I would comment on thinking, planning, labeling my thoughts, and it very quickly went to one of my deepest fears. And then the feeling of fear and trying to label that. So having me a little more circumspect, I don't know what I should do with it, but got to this place.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Time for one more? Yeah? No? Yeah.
I felt nicer to myself by giving myself permission for those thoughts to be okay, and I felt more, I liked myself better
Yeah, that's wonderful.
instead of the judgment.
Yeah, thank you. So I thought I would talk about what happens to me, because I've been doing this practice a lot lately. So when I practice with thoughts, I generally am, what happens to me is that I'll be quiet, and then a thought will arise, and I'll be lost in it for a little while. And then I'll kind of wake up in the middle of the thought, or my awareness will get bigger than the thought or something. And then I'm aware that I'm thinking, but as soon as I'm aware that I'm thinking, the thought starts to dissipate. As it starts to dissipate, it stops being verbal. Like there's still this sense of my mind moving, but it's not verbal anymore. And then, and when the movement ceases, there's sometimes still like a body feeling, because I have some, if it's fear, there's some emotional reaction to what I'm thinking. And then sometimes so when I do this practice, and so I'm just sitting down to do meditation with thoughts, then I'm not trying to settle so much as you usually are, because you need thoughts to do meditation on thoughts. And so sometimes it's just like one thought after another, and sometimes after a while I settle enough that there's space between thoughts, and then I can just kind of rest in that space, which is kind of interesting. So to come back to your question, I think that the way this practice is designed, whatever thoughts arise are whatever thoughts arise. And part of my observation of my own mind is that I have very little control over what thoughts arise. I mean, it's true that I can choose to think something, and it's actually an interesting exercise if you want to play with it. When I first was trying to figure out how to pay attention to my thoughts, because I had trouble, because I've been doing these other kind of breath meditations for so many years, that I was used to moving into a state where there was no thought. And so I started out by actually deliberately thinking and watching those thoughts. So I would think, I wonder about what Sam's doing right now. But I would be deliberately thinking it. But most of the time, and we do that like when we're studying, or there's times when we're directing our thoughts. But most of the time, the thoughts that come up, you're not choosing them at all. Good, bad, indifferent, it doesn't matter. They're just happening. So part of this practice, I think, is to move towards something like Michael Singer's experience, where you begin to realize that these thoughts are just happening, and we call them our thoughts because they're happening in us, but they're not our thoughts in the sense that we're directing them. So if they're bad thoughts, if we just think about killing somebody, but it's just arising in us, we're not saying, I'm going to think about killing somebody. It's just a thought that comes up, and then we can look at it and go, oh, that's weird that I'm thinking about killing somebody, and the thought will dissolve. And then another thought will come up about how wonderful some person is. And they come up, in rapid succession. Fantasies are things that scare us, things that we're angry about, it all comes up. So this practice is really to just be aware of whatever is happening, good, bad, or indifferent. Let's see, what else? There's anything else I wanted to say before I open it for discussion. So Mingyur Rinpoche talks about that for some people, it's sometimes like for me, when you look at thoughts, the thoughts tend to disappear. And that's great, because then when they disappear, you can just rest in this moment. And for other people, or at other times, you can watch the thoughts like you're watching a movie. And they're just going, and you can watch them. And that's great, because then they are a wonderful support for being present to what's happening for you right now, which is thinking. So, and when we are meditating, what I'm finding, it's really fun, and I think you mentioned this, Margie, did I got your name right? I'm so bad with names. So that I'm not mad when I start to think, because I can just pay attention to the thoughts. So it doesn't end my meditation or stop my meditation or ruin it. It's just another object that I can turn my attention, my awareness to during the meditation. And that's very freeing, because I'm not fighting with anything when I'm meditating. And it also helps because when we see our thoughts just as thoughts, and we don't identify with them as strongly, they can't boss us around as much. So I'm really noticing a lot how my thoughts are, a lot of my thoughts are like, this is something, they really think they're important. I guess that's what it is. I have a thought, I should do a class on X, and it feels really important, like I really should do a class on X, and they have this like grip on you, that they want you to like think that they're important. But if you can just look at them, then they begin to dissolve and their grip weakens. And Ty always reminds us to always ask about the things that we think, am I sure? It's one of the mantras he likes to teach. And I think when we watch our thoughts and know them as just thoughts, the power they have to make us believe in them is lessened. And it is easier to ask that question, am I sure? So I'll leave it there. So as always, feel free to question, comment, and beginning by putting your palms together and bowing. Thank you for listening. You're hiding back there, I couldn't see you.
I think about the difference between thoughts and beliefs. So how, I mean, because if I'm sitting and I'm watching my thoughts, all these thoughts come in and they come and they go. But some I get really fixated on. So I just think about, like, for instance, if I'm thinking how my neighbor doesn't like me. You know, it might come and go, but there are some that like to get really fixated on and get really stuck on. And I do coaching, so I try to help people shift some of those thoughts. But I think, well, are they thoughts or are they beliefs? Because there's some that are stickier than
Yeah.
others we think or believe over and over again. So I'm just curious your thoughts about that.
Well, I have the same experience. Some thoughts are stickier than others. James Beres has this one practice that he teaches that I think is kind of interesting that he did on retreat one time, which is we always have a lot of recurrent thoughts which are related to what you're calling beliefs. So I think my neighbor doesn't like me, and it just keeps coming up. Variations of that come up over and over and over again, and he calls it his top 10 list. And so he's meditating and he's just noticing what's happening and he's thinking, and he says, okay, that's number 3. Yeah, and that one's number 5. That's number 1 again. It's like, so he numbered them when he was in this retreat. And I think that that's actually kind of useful, is like to realize that these are they're just stories that we're running over and over again. And they may have some reality and they may not. But they're just stories. They're still just thoughts, I think. Other comments?
First of all, thank you. This has just been amazing, and you're touching on all kinds of things for me.
Okay.
And then I have a question, which might be too broad, but how does all this connect with whatever insight meditation is?
Okay, that's a short topic. So you're going to be here till 9? No. So I'll keep it brief. So the idea is, I understand it. So I've been practicing for a long time, but I've been learning not so long, about how this all fits together. And so, as I understand it, the idea is that through calming, in the Tibetan tradition, I have to say, because there's many Buddhist traditions and they're all different. In the Tibetan tradition, the idea is that through calming our mind, as I mentioned, the words pliable and workable that Mingyur Rinpoche uses, that we have more ability to direct our mind where we want it to go. So once we can direct our mind where we want it to go, we can do 2 things. So one of them is related to what you asked about. So we can direct our mind towards positive thoughts. So for example, doing loving kindness meditation. But the other thing that we can do is we can direct our minds toward a certain analytical approach to our experience, using Buddhist concepts as kind of a foundation. And they call that analytical meditation. And that's what they call vipassana, or insight meditation, which is different from what they call insight meditation in the American insight meditation tradition. So their view is that you do the shamatha meditation in order to get the stability of mind. I mean, that's not the only reason, because it has its own benefits. But in terms of being able to liberate yourself from our ups and downs and find lasting happiness, they argue that we need to be able to penetrate into the nature of reality by doing this kind of analytical meditation. We have time for a couple more comments.
not to judge. But I also wonder sometimes when I'm feeling distressed, if maybe I've already done regular sitting practice, and I notice that I'm distressed, sometimes I get out my folder that has the Dharma. It has wholesome mental formations on one side and unwholesome mental formations on another side. And I don't know if this fits in with the Tibetan tradition, but I know Thai has said if you are feeling distressed, you can sometimes notice, well, what am I doing? Am I feeling arrogant? Am I feeling scared? Am I feeling... And just by noticing that, then you kind of connect with the universal quality of the negative emotion that doesn't feel very good. And how about like purposefully, because sometimes I'll do this and it can be helpful, turning toward the wholesome mental formations and saying, compassion would feel better than judgment. And so steering ourselves, does that fit into the practices that you're doing? What do you think about that?
So I'm just, part of my curiosity as I wander into this Tibetan tradition is how it's the same and different, and I think it's different there. So it's certainly in this practice, the way it's taught in the Joy of Living, Turgar's meditation teaching program, there's no, it's non-judgmental. It's much more like John Kabat-Zinn's approach. So there's no judgment. You're not trying to discriminate between good thoughts and bad thoughts. Whatever is happening, you're just mindful of it, or aware of it. They tend to use the word awareness. With the idea that if you allow all of your experience, then you have the possibility of settling back into your true nature. So you allow everything to happen, but the one who is aware is your true nature from their perspective. And so that you don't need to judge. So it's an interesting difference. So they don't have as much of that. But the Vajrayana, the Tibetan Buddhism, is a kind of Vajrayana Buddhism, and it very much has the attitude that you incorporate everything into your practice, so that everything becomes food for the transformation that you're creating. So I think it is different that way.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. That doesn't mean, I don't want to imply that they're right and the other one's wrong, but because they're just different approaches.
Excuse me, but sometimes I wonder, am I really successfully transferring over to this other thing, or am I just operating under the illusion that I have enough control that I can... It's like what James Barra says, inclining the mind toward. So you're inclining the mind toward joy or these wholesome things, or it seems that way. But I like the idea that maybe it happens automatically if you stop trying to control it and just allow the feelings to instruct you without trying to be a mechanic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dawn. Could you comment a little on daily practice and extended practice, like retreat practice, and how this applies?
I don't know. I'm not sure what you're looking for.
Well, it seems that for a lot of the practices taught by the Buddha, he was teaching monastics
Mm-hmm.
who did daily practice, a lot of daily practice, and did extended retreat practice.
Mm-hmm.
And for instance, Thich Nhat Hanh does not have a lot of emphasis on intensive retreat experience,
Mm-hmm.
more on daily practice and moment-to-moment practice.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, just sort of how that, I think in the Tibetan tradition, it's very much about extended, deep practice,
Mhm.
right? So how does that relate to someone who's doing mostly daily practice?
Well, I think that, so there's a couple answers to that. So, it's clear that in the Tibetan tradition, I'm attracted to retreat practice, as you know, and so the Tibetan tradition is very rich in encouragement to do long and intensive retreats. At the same time, the Mahamudra tradition that Mingyur Rinpoche teaches from, was often a lay practice tradition, and so he's designed these joy of living practices to be done as a practice that you do 20 or 30 minutes a day, and like Thai, you continue it as a daily practice, because you don't just need to notice your thoughts or notice your body or notice your senses when you're sitting on the cushion. So I think that, and I think that, so that kind of makes sense to me intuitively for those who don't have time or interest in intensive practice, and actually you're someone who does do some intensive practice. But for people who don't have the time and interest to do that, I think that what Thai offers and what Joy of Living offers are a good path, which is that you do some meditation every day, just like a pianist practices scales. So you practice these skills of being able to be aware of everything in your experience, of cultivating loving kindness, of being able to see into the nature of reality. And then you carry that out into your day in all those aspects. So that's what I think. I am not an authority, though.
You're not.
No, I am definitely not. It's one of the things I found out hanging out with all the Turgar folks, and that I know diddly squat babes. So, but I'm okay sitting up here because we all circulate up here and we all know diddly squat together. But together maybe we know combined a little more than diddly squat. So I will share the merit. So may the virtue that's created by this practice, may all the good things that we have nurtured by this practice not only serve to support the growth of wisdom in ourselves and the growth of happiness and peace in ourselves, but when we also share that benefit with all beings in the hope that all beings, every single one throughout the whole universe, will be able to find lasting happiness by learning to embody the loving, boundless awareness that's their true nature.